My box says we're live, so I guess we are.
Actually, yeah, and we should have checked my.
Yep.
Okay. I was gonna just see if I can get my PowerPoint presentation up there and see how it looks.
Well, go ahead and try that.
Um,
In case we have people who are waiting until the very last minute to join us.
okay, so if I flash that up, are you seeing a PowerPoint presentation now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Along with your slides on the left column.
Yeah, okay. So so let me see if I go, and this is the problem last time. If I try to
If you go down to the very bottom of your screen on the right-hand corner, there's that little box. It looks.
I don't want to go full screen though.
Okay.
Because then that obscures my notes, which are also on the computer.
Got it.
Isn't it the button on the menu that says slideshow? Isn't that what you need to hit?
Well, I've
Instead of
got
view slideshow.
I can say, if I say play from the current slide, I can use that. And you should be just seeing the cover of the book now. Is that what you're seeing?
No,
You're not seeing The Righteous Mind?
no, we see a definition of moral capital.
What the heck?
Moral capital.
All right, that's strange. I don't get that at all.
Figure out how many more we need to be with her.
Let's run out loud. All right. Let me restart that. I mean, it doesn't bother me if you all see my slides there coming up.
Yeah.
It's just super frustrating.
But now you're no longer on screen sharing. We just
Yeah,
see
no,
each
I
other now.
have to start that up again.
We had
Yeah.
one cord to turn that on.
All right.
There
How
you go.
about
There you
now?
go.
That's the
That's
book.
great.
Yeah, that's the
There's
book
a step-on cord
title, book
here
cover.
with the,
All right. And okay, well,
There you go.
yeah, but the problem here is, I can go. I guess I can adjust. I can do it with my trackpad. Well, that might work. Okay, well, I think this will, if I can go all the way back up here. All right, and so you're now looking at the cover of the book,
Yes.
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 Righteous Mind. Okay, I might be able to make a go with this. It's still different than it is last week, but let's try it.
Okay. So we are, I guess, about ready to start. And this is the fourth and final week of Greg's presentation of Render Under Caesar. And we appreciate his helping us connect politics and religion. Today's emphasis is on the book Righteous Mind. And that's, I guess, on many of your screens, if not all of you. The business is two-part. One is that the program for the Covenant class that was distributed a long time ago has a confusion in that Tony was scheduled to do the December classes. Doug Atati has very kindly agreed to cover those 3 Sundays, and he's still scrambling to figure out what his topic will be. But I'm sure that it will be entertaining and informative. So the class will be meeting for the first 3 Sundays in December, and Doug Otati will be doing that class.
What about the rest of November?
It's over.
Oh.
And the last item of business is to encourage all of you to unmute yourselves and listen for Cecil Clifton to get us started with a rounding version of happy birthday, because it is Greg's birthday today.
Oh, good heavens.
Okay, everybody on 3. 1, 2, 3.
Happy
birthday
birthday
to
to you.
you.
Happy
Happy birthday
birthday
to you.
Happy
Happy
birthday,
birthday,
dear
dear
Greg.
Greg.
Happy
Happy
birthday
birthday
to
to
you.
Thanks to everyone.
Thank you. That was definitely memorable. Thank you.
I'm not sure.
That's a good start to the day. Thank you. So wait, now does that mean I'm on here, Van? Are we
Yes, yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah.
okay?
I'm done with the class. It's your turn.
All right.
Thank you.
Guess I gotta take over. Well, thank you. Thank you for the happy birthday greetings. We're off to a good start so far this year. Thanks for dropping in on the session here and for being a part of this so far. Today's book is The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. Sometimes I slip into calling him Haidt, but it's actually Jonathan Haidt is how it's pronounced. And this is a book that came out in 2012, and it's been circulating a good bit. I don't know, has anyone else, have folks run into this book at all? Encountered this? I can't, of course, I can't see you all. I just have you all in a little strip here off to the right. So I don't know if people are saying yes or no. I'm flipping through. Maybe not. Haidt he is something like a public intellectual, I think, because he does TED Talks and appears on talk shows and so forth that are relatively kind of widely seen. So he's not just holed up in an academic niche doing his thing. He is actually out there in public venues talking about his stuff. So he's relatively well known. I guess maybe these things aren't quite selling at Target yet, but he's getting a good bit of play these days, partly because his main goal in this is to try to answer and deal with this question of polarization. And this book was written, or actually it came out in 2012. And even in 2012, he was concerned about the issue of polarization, why good people are divided by politics and religion. You can see the subtitle there. And if it seemed like a problem in 2012, it seems like a bigger problem in 2020 as we head into 2021. So he wants to answer this question of why good people are divided by politics and religion. And ultimately the goal is to try to create some sort of mutual understanding, some platform, some shared context that would allow people to cross this boundary, to converse with each other in a spirit of mutual respect and shared citizenship and shared identity and so forth. And to do this, he tries to understand what it is that is getting in the way, why people are having such difficulty with this. And the very short answer is that people on the left and the right, progressives, liberals, or conservatives, he would resist calling them Democrats and Republicans, even though there's a good amount of overlap between progressive liberals, Democrats, conservatives, and Republicans. He would say that, in a nutshell, the main difficulty that folks are encountering in those conversations is because they have different moral foundations, as he says, different moral matrices would be another way of describing that. The book's called The Righteous Mind because he claims that the human mind is, for reasons of evolutionary development and social development, the human mind is intrinsically moralistic, critical, and judgmental. And this is for psychological and sociological reasons and just the way things have evolved. So those are the questions he wants to answer in a nutshell, the solution he gives, and why the book has the title that it does. It comes, oh wait, here, let me see if I can get one. There we are. Oh, so there's Haight right there. Okay. And you can see there he is giving a TED talk, and that means you've arrived in some sense. If you can give a TED talk. He's currently teaching at New York University's Stern School of Business. He was at the University of Virginia for many years, and then a few years back went up to NYU. And as he says, my mission is to use research on moral psychology to help people understand each other and help important social institutions work better. And you'll see articles. There was a recent article, not by him, but about him in the Atlantic just a couple months ago, in which he sort of updates some of the things that he talked about in 2012. So that may be of interest to folks. So I can advance the slide here. Oop. Okay. So the book comes in 3 parts, and this is another one of the virtues of this book. It's got a ton of stuff in it. I found it somewhat challenging to use with students because we're not evolutionary biologists, we're not psych majors, we're not sociologists, and he spends a lot of time dipping in and out of all of these fields and citing scientific studies and so forth. But one of the virtues of the book that does make it usable is it's eminently clear and well organized, and he's really taking pains to make all this material fall into sequentially arranged parts and to be tagged with interesting and memorable metaphors. And at the end of each section, he sums up everything that he's done in a pithy way, so that you can, even if you don't read the whole book, but you were to go through and just read the summary sections, you could get a real good sense for what he's up to. So in that sense, I think the book is an admirable instance of an academic writing for a popular audience, not dumbing down the subject at all, but taking great care to organize his thoughts. So the first part of the book, the first of the 3 parts, is that intuitions, he says, come first when it comes to moral judgment, and strategic reasoning.
Thought of a reason to go check the tree.
And the metaphor that he has that characterizes this section is that of the elephant and the rider. He would say that when it comes to making moral judgments and taking up moral, and he would say political positions, that is not under the control of the rational reasoning faculties. It's under control of the intuitions and the emotions. And in that sense, the intuitions and the emotions are taking the role of the elephant, and the rider is strategic reasoning, rational faculties, and basically, well, I'll go into that a little bit. Let me just lay out the 3 sections, and then we'll go back and we'll talk about them individually. So the second main part of the book is there's more to morality than harm and fairness. And here's where he lays out what he calls his theory of moral foundations. The controlling metaphor in this section is that this righteous mind, this judgmental mind, this critical mind that people have and deploy in political discussions is like a tongue with 6 taste receptors. So he talks about 6 different moral foundations, and we'll go through all 6 of these in just a bit. That's the second middle part of the book. Third one, there we are. That morality, as he says, binds and blinds both. Morality, and he'll finally get to a definition of what he means by that in the third part of the book, that morality is what binds communities together. It's what makes them work. It's their exoskeleton. So it's a crucially important thing in that capacity as something that makes communities work. But at the same time, it also blinds you to the logics and the virtues of other moral communities, other moral matrices. And this is what is really the dilemma in political discourse today, that people are living in a couple of different moral communities, and this is what makes it hard for them to converse with each other. So that the animal metaphor that he chooses for this section of the book is chimps and bees. And by chimp, he means he's likening humankind to an animal that is sort of works in social environments, but still is kind of relatively freestanding and individual, but that human communities aren't completely like that, that they are also in certain fundamental ways like hives, and that they operate very powerfully in groups, and that they can form superorganisms like beehives. So chimp and bee, that's the animal metaphor for the third part of the book. Let me just page ahead here just a little bit. Okay. So let me go back just and say just a little bit about intuition, about the first section, where do morals come from? So he spends a good amount of time in here, and let me set my clock up here. I want to do like last week and try to leave time for questions. And I'm also very amenable to being interrupted. So if at any point you want to just, I guess if everyone is on mute, maybe you can't quite interrupt me, but please feel free to interrupt me if you want to unmute and interject something. So let me just make sure I got my clock up here. So very briefly on this first part, intuitions and strategic reading, elephant and rider, he spends a good amount of time in here talking about some classical moral debates that would be familiar to many of you. Where do morals come from? Are morals innate? Are they something that is inscribed on our circuit boards by nature? Do we come with these things? Is it a matter of training? Is it a matter of nurture? Is it a matter of social learning? How do these things, how do people's moral frameworks come to be? And so he goes through some classic ways of explaining moral frameworks, and he looks at Jean Piaget, Lawrence Kohlberg, and Elliot Turiel, and other such people to try to understand where these moral frameworks come about. And after experimenting with all of these different ways of thinking about the origins of moral frameworks, he comes out with a couple of results. One, that the discussion about moral frameworks tends to be kind of isolated from other cultures. And the way that he gets the foundation really for this book is his own research of where he writes these little sort of parables or stories and gets people to react to them and comment on them. So, and some of these are kind of odd. Let me see if I've got I've written down a couple of these little stories. He has, no, I can't find where this thing is here in my notes. So I won't be able to. Get it exactly, but here I can just look it up in the book. So one of his little stories is this: a family's dog was killed by a car in front of their house. They had heard that dog meat was delicious, so they cut up the dog's body and cooked it and ate it for dinner. Nobody saw them do this. So he would take this little story and he would read it out to people and get them to react to that? Like, is there something, is there something intrinsically wrong with this? Is this a practice that you would condemn? And if so, why would you condemn this practice? Is this morally wrong? You might say, oh, that's gross, or that's sick or disgusting, but is it morally wrong? And he would get people to issue an opinion on this. So here's another one. This is also interesting. A man goes to the supermarket once a week and buys a chicken. But before cooking the chicken, he has sexual intercourse with it. Then he cooks it and eats it. How's that for Sunday morning? So he would get people to react to this. And then, of course, there doesn't seem to be any harm to anyone here. No one is, no one even knows about this. It's an entirely individual practice. But, getting people to react to this, getting them to give some kind of moral judgment about this, again, as people are sorting out and trying to find reasons why. Now, that's really awful. You shouldn't be doing that, but is it morally wrong? Well, no one's harmed. So he does, this is really the foundation for the book, the research that he does. He writes up a lot of these little stories, and he performs research. He reads these little stories to people in different kinds of locations. So one place that he goes to Brazil, and he devises some of these stories for the Brazilian context. He reads them to upper class Brazilian society, and he reads them to lower class elements of another part of Brazilian society. He also does this in Philadelphia, where he was a grad student at the University of Pennsylvania, and he gets people to react to these stories and to try to explain why they think it's moral, immoral, or good or bad. And it's based on people's reactions that he arrives at this result, that the intuitions, when it comes to making moral judgments on these kinds of stories, that people react based on emotions and intuitions, and it's only after they've already reacted that their strategic reasoning faculty comes in to try to justify what their emotional reactions were. So it's he likens the strategic reasoning faculty to a rider on an elephant. The rider can sort of, in some instances guide the elephant, but the elephant is the far more powerful element of that partnership, and the rider ends up typically justifying what the elephant does. It's kind of like your inner lawyer or your inner press secretary that will justify your behavior after the fact. So one of the things that he figures out in the course of telling these stories to people is that the way that moralists like Piaget and Kohlberg and others have gone about trying to understand morals was very culture specific. It was very Western. It was very educated, industrialist, and rich and democratic. And actually, that he puts a name on that. If you take the first letters from all of those, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, you end up with weird. And he calls this a weird morality. That is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And so one of his breakthroughs is to try to understand the moral life of different communities, different socioeconomic classes, and in different cultures. It was a revelatory experience for him in the course of his research to go and spend a significant amount of time in India, where I think he did a Fulbright fellowship, where his postdoctoral advisor had spent some time, and to see how things run in Indian culture and to see how out of sync his Western moral liberal instincts were when they were transplanted in Indian society. His normal instincts, excuse me, for example, how they tripped in when he saw how women in Indian society were treated or marginalized, and how servants were treated or marginalized. And found himself initially wanting to sort of correct what was going on in that environment, but then found himself, some of his guests kind of chided him for being too nice to his servants and telling them thank you and so forth. And so he ended up taking a step back, and this was kind of formative for him because it allowed him to step back from whatever moral matrix he brought to that situation and to try to examine it from a distanced perspective. So that seems to have been a kind of a fundamental experience for him. He spends a good amount of time looking at also classical philosophical traditions that look at the emotions, the passions, and the reason. He looks at Plato, he looks at Thomas Jefferson, he looks at Enlightenment philosophers like David Hume. Plato, for example, is a philosopher that thinks the rational faculty, the mind, should prevail over the emotions and the passions, and that philosopher kings who should rule the city are the most rational and the most reasonable people who have achieved mastery over their emotions and their passions. And that also is typically the province of the male, who can achieve that kind of victory. Females, almost by definition, aren't able to master their passions and let their emotions and intuitions rule over their rational faculties, and that's why they're not fit to rule. So Plato privileges reason over the passions. David Hume, Enlightenment philosopher, and in some ways they're running against some aspects of the Enlightenment, takes the opposite view, that the reason should actually be, if not, it is, but he even thinks that maybe there's a certain logic to it, should be the servant of the passions. And that's not just sort of how it is, but even how it should be. And then Thomas Jefferson, according to Haidt, takes a more mixed view that reason and passions operate a little bit more like co-emperors, right? The things go back and forth. In the final analysis, Haidt sides with David Hume, and that is, again, the elephant and the rider image, that intuitions are like the elephant and the rider is like reason. Rather than guiding the elephant pretty much goes where it wants, and the rider's job is basically to rationalize and justify the actions of the elephant. So this is one reason why people in discussions with people across partisan divides find it so difficult and so frustrating to deal with people outside of their own moral matrix, right? They're talking to the writer, right? They think if they could somehow convince the writer through rational argumentation or giving certain reasons or addressing certain criticisms, that they're going to either sort of vanquish the other perspective or even get a hearing. And in fact, that's just not going to work, because that is not where people's moral center is. The center is in the elephant. And if you want to talk across this partisan divide, if you want to talk from one moral matrix to the other, you've got to figure out a way to talk to the elephant, not the rider. So that would be one of the takeaways from that first section of the book. So the second portion of the book is where he lays out this business of moral foundations. One of the things also, and this goes back to his India trip, is that Western societies, and typically weird moralities, Western educated industrial democratic and rich societies tend to be more focused on individuals, whereas non-Western societies tend to be focused more on families, clans, groups. They tend to privilege groups rather than individuals. And this leads to a different kind of moral architecture, if you will. Let's see, okay, so there's 3. So here's the 6 moral foundations. We can go through these just in a little bit more detail, but here are all 6 of them up on the screen. The first one of these is care and fairness. The second, fairness and actually not care and fairness. No. That's just here. Let me just go ahead and correct this. Care and harm. Care and harm. Second is fairness, cheating. The third is liberty / oppression. Fourth is loyalty and betrayal. Fifth, authority and subversion. Sixth, sanctity and degradation. And through writing up these little stories, these parables, and cataloging people's response, and he did this with hundreds of people in different cultures and different kind of social economic levels, he isolated these 6 basic instincts or sort of taste buds when it comes to taking up moral positions. So he thinks that these are all relatively independent kinds of moral foundations, just like taste buds or taste receptors are in the mouth, right? You've got sweet, you've got sour, you've got bitter, you've got savory, you've got whatever the other taste sensations are. So let me go through a few of these just in brief. So the first of these is the care harm foundation. So it's the care harm foundation that makes us sensitive to signs of suffering and need. It makes us despise cruelty and want to care for those who are suffering. And he goes into a fair amount of detail about the origin of all of these moral foundations. Again, from the standpoint of evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology. So he would say that these moral foundations are actually grounded in the evolution of the human species and how we've come to be where we are today as a species. And so that the origin of this care harm foundation evolved as the instinct to care for vulnerable members of our own species. Okay. Fairness and cheating foundation. This makes us sensitive to those who are trying to get something for nothing. This is a little bit more of a sociological kind of foundation. The origin, he says, of this particular foundation is an adaptation to group life and the free rider problem, right? If there is someone in a group who tries to reap the benefits of being in the group, but without taking on the dangers or the liabilities of being in the group, that person is going to be kind of singled out and shunned and suppressed, maybe thrown out of the group. So it would be someone who, let's say in a situation where there's a battle or a competition with another tribe, that the people who are on the front lines of the battle, who undergo the greatest amount of risk and who might undergo the greatest danger of death and therefore have no opportunity to pass their genes on to the future generation, might be at a disadvantage compared to this cheater free rider who kind of hangs back from the front lines and then still manages to go back home and transmit his genes to the next generation. So this is kind of a defense mechanism against that evolutionary possibility in the social life of groups. The Liberty Oppression Foundation is the urge to resist or overthrow bullies and oppressors. Origin for this, he would say, this evolved in response to the adaptive challenge of living in small groups with individuals who would, if given the opportunity or given the chance, would dominate, bully, and constrain the others, right? There's a certain point at which, the biggest gorilla, the strongest gorilla is just going to be too much of a pain for the rest of the people in the group. And other people, other gorillas in this instance, are going to band together and take steps to suppress, dominate, get rid of this person who is disrupting the social life of the group. The fourth one is the loyalty and betrayal foundation. So this question is, to answer this question, is this other person a team player? Will this person be loyal to the team? Will they sell us out for personal gain? So the trait of loyalty to the group at all costs is prized, whereas, someone who's going to choose their own self-interest at the expense of the group is obviously going to be shunned for this reason. Its origin involved in response to the adaptive challenge of forming and maintaining coalitions and groups. So nothing too surprising about that, right? People who can maintain a loyalty to their own social group are prized. People who can't do that are shunned. Then there's the authority subversion foundation. This is the foundation that makes us sensitive to rank or status and to signs that other people are or are not behaving properly given their position. As far as its origin, this, he says, evolved from the formation of effective groups, which tend to involve hierarchies, right? I mean, if you have a completely flat group where there's no hierarchies, there's no sort of leadership function, no follower function, that can actually lead to certain kinds of chaos or anarchies. Now, I don't know, is anyone out there keep chickens? Do any backyard chicken farms or grow up dealing with chickens? My father, I know.
I have chickens.
Oh yeah, Steve. Yeah. There you are. Okay. So I heard from one of my chicken farmer friends that for like a chicken roost. Now, how many chickens do you have?
4.
Is there a hierarchy that forms among them?
I can tell you who's 1 and who's 2 and 3 and 4. Yeah.
And how do you know that? Is it just like one dominates the others, or
Watch their behavior when they're trying to eat, and the number 4 is the last one to get to eat, and the others will keep her away from the food, or just watch them. And then the top people peck at the bottom people, but not vice versa. They don't have equal sort of peck aggressive activity. So it's not hard.
the pecking order has got real meaning then in this instance? Yeah.
Real
Okay.
meaning.
So now, do they roost? Do they have different levels, like as far as roosting goes?
No, but I don't have the house set up for different levels of roosting. So, and I've not gone in there at night and tried to do that observation.
Okay. Well, one of my friends who keeps a lot of chickens and is sort of an expert in this says, in his chicken roost, you gotta have roosts at different levels, right? If you don't have any roosts where the chickens can't sort of find their natural hierarchy, it does lead to violent internecine behavior among chickens, and that they're really much happier if they can sort themselves out according to some kind of hierarchy. So your experience of, some chickens being on the top and some on the bottom, I think is kind of an instance of that.
Yeah.
So that in social groups, there are these kinds of natural hierarchies, and that this moral foundation actually has its origins in a sense that some kind of hierarchy is correct, but you also don't want some kind of people stepping out of the hierarchy, putting on airs or assuming more authority than they should naturally deserve. So that, with the chicken digression is That's the Authority Subversion Foundation. The final one is the Sanctity Degradation Foundation. And this is what makes it possible for people to invest objects, certain objects, totems maybe, like flags with irrational and extreme values, which are important for binding groups together. He finds the origin of this in the evolution of human beings and their diet, particularly the omnivore's dilemma. Omnivores can avail themselves of different kinds of foods. They can eat meat, they can eat seeds or grubs or leaves or whatever. But at the same time, you have to be fairly discriminating when it comes down to separating good foods and bad foods. There's a certain kind of fear of pollution that goes along with this. So this is where he finds the origin of this particular foundation. So without going into that in any greater detail, one of his findings is that liberals and progressives tend to appeal to three of these moral foundations, in particular: care harm, fairness, cheating, liberty, and oppression, while conservatives appeal to all six. And in fact, that some of these other foundations, these moral foundations like loyalty and betrayal, authority and subversion, sanctity, degradation, not only do sort of liberals and progressives tend to not make appeals to those, they see those as negatives, in fact, whereas conservatives are able to incorporate that into their kind of the moral appeals and arguments that they make. And that's not to say that conservatives don't recognize care, harm, fairness, cheating, or liberty and oppression. They do recognize those, but they're balanced out with all of these others that liberals and progressives don't appeal to and don't recognize or positively criticize. So Haidt's claim is that this gives conservatives a richer set of tastes to work with. Now, I don't think, well, I'd have to be a little bit careful. I was going to say he would not necessarily impute intrinsic value to all six of these. Like, he wouldn't say that conservatives are correct or right or true in these, in holding more moral foundations or working with more moral foundations. But in fact, once you get to the end of the book, that's basically, I think, where he does come down. Partly, I think, because he does, he's working with a evolutionary biological perspective, a social evolutionary perspective. And I think he would finally say that when it comes down to understanding human beings and that the way that they operate in groups, that some of these other foundations like loyalty and betrayal, authority, subversion, and sanctity and degradation do actually have their sort of roots in human psychology and in human sociology, and that they actually do have a function, that there is something true about them. And that places, that gives certain advantages to people who can operate with those moral foundations. I've thrown in just at the end of this slide that I think that's a pretty good answer to the what's the matter with Kansas problem. This is a book you might recognize that came out in, I think it was early 2000s, 2004, that tried to answer the question, why is it that people of lower socioeconomic status so routinely vote against their very clear and evident economic self-interest? Why does that happen? And Haidt's answer to that is they're not voting. They may be voting against their economic self-interest, but that's not what's driving people. People's moral foundations are driving the way that they vote and their political behavior. And if you see people's voting patterns as tied to these moral foundations, it makes perfect sense why they're voting the way they are. So in a sense, I think Haidt gives a fairly deep answer to that particular problem.
Greg,
Yeah.
do you get the sense that he sets this whole thing up almost like a conservative would set it up? His way of describing what fairness is and what loyalty is seemed to me to be a conservative way to describe those morals. So if the opposite of fairness is to cheat for advantage, then that strikes me as a conservative's way to look at fairness. And if loyalty, if you're not loyal, you're doing something for personal gain. I think the Secretary of State of Georgia would take offense with that sort of description of loyalty. He's being called a rhino by folks, but the Secretary of State of Georgia might be disloyal, but he's not disloyal for personal gain. And the way he's framed these things, and fairness is not, the opposite of somebody who's not being fair is not necessarily someone who's cheating in a set of rules. I don't know. It just strikes me he's coming at this as a conservative.
Well, I think he ends up, and he sort of charts it, he would probably describe himself as conservative in the final analysis, or at the very least, recognizing the value of conservatism. I hadn't really thought about, critiquing the way these foundations are set up. Is that a conservative way of thinking about it? And it may just be my own limited description of them that makes him open to that charge. I think if you were to, so loyalty and foundation, that's a good one to think of, or loyalty and subversion with respect to what's going on in Georgia right now. Yeah, Steve, geez, I don't know if I know exactly how to answer that critique. That may be the case, but in a sort of a more detailed inspection of those, my sense is that they probably are a little bit more neutral, that he wouldn't be susceptible to your criticism quite so much as this brief presentation would suggest. I think he is striving to be balanced, but he is himself, I think, as he says at the end of the book, he does see the value in certain conservative claims and arguments. So, for example, I think he's a kind of a Adam Smith, Edmund Burke kind of conservative who sees values in certain kinds of traditions and institutions that maintain what he calls moral capital in groups. So he is gonna advocate for that. So in that sense, you are right. He does come at this from something of a conservative standpoint.
When he was at Virginia, he did not include liberty and oppression in his work, in the Moral Foundations work from UVA. And that seems to be somewhat of a later addition to the Moral Foundations than the other five. And I was a little surprised he ceded that territory to the liberals, because it was a two and three thing at UVA, not a three thing. So, and then adding liberty, I don't see the liberals driving their trucks down the main street with "Don't Tread on Me" flags. I mean, liberty's a weird one to give to the liberals.
Well, he does say it kind of cashes out that particular foundation. Like, you're right. That was the sixth foundation. He had worked with 5 of these for several years, but then started to rethink a couple of them. Like the fairness cheating one cashes out a little bit different for liberals and conservatives. Like for conservatives, that cashes out more as proportionality rather than fairness and liberty and oppression can cash out in different ways for progressives and conservatives. So for progressives, liberty, oppression might cash out in certain kinds of anti-authoritarian ways, like, the anti-slavery movement, for example. Whereas for conservatives, like you said, it might cash out in that freedom from government oppression and regulation and so forth. So that can go in a couple of different directions. But you're right, that was a late addition to these taste receptors, liberty and oppression. So anyway, but those are good questions. I think maybe my telegraphic explanation of these things is partly to blame. But let me, we're getting here at 10:30. Let me speed along just a little bit and get into the third part of the book, which is morality binds and blinds. And in this particular section, this is where he talks about religion and the value of religion in maintaining social groups. This is where he talks about individual via the group and spends time thinking about the things that get a collocation of individuals to function together as a group, as a hive. And he has one really interesting anecdote from William McNeill, a historian who, when he served in World War II, experienced this kind of physical high that people get in marching. Like, he wasn't, and if there's any of you that are veterans out there, this is not something that I've experienced, but William McNeill talked about the experience that he had in marching. He said, here's what McNeill had to say about it: "Words are inadequate to describe the emotion aroused by the prolonged movement in unison that drilling involved. A sense of pervasive well-being is what I recall. More specifically, a strange sense of personal enlargement, a sort of swelling out, becoming bigger than life, thanks to participation in collective ritual." That was McNeill's little comment on marching. And the quote that I put up on this slide here is from an interview that McNeill did. He went out and researched this. He was interested in this as far as the history of warfare goes. And he had this anecdote from a veteran who said, "Many veterans who are honest with themselves will admit, I believe, that the experience of communal effort in battle has been the high point of their lives. Their I, their individual ego, passes insensibly into a we. My becomes our, and individual fate loses its central importance. I believe that it is nothing less than the assurance of immortality that makes self-sacrifice at these moments so relatively easy. I may fall, but I do not die. For that which is real in me goes forward and lives on in the comrades for whom I gave up my life." So this is an instance of someone who has gotten over their own kind of personal identity, their own selfish ego, and found a way to privilege the group and its priorities. And this is where he spends time talking about the function of religion. Now, he himself, Haidt, is he's not at all religious. He freely confesses to being an atheist, but at the same time, he's a different sort of atheist than some of these popular writers, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, those folks, right? The four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse that are out there criticizing religious people who just think, religion is stupid, and we'd be all much better without it. In fact, Haidt says, no, religion actually serves great many useful functions when it comes down to getting groups to operate efficiently and as superorganisms that can finally advance their own interests. And one of the images that he uses, and this is an illustration from the book, is the maypole dance, and how this maypole organizes and centralizes the movements of all these dancers around it. They're going in different directions. And the maypole dance, obviously being a kind of a springtime fertility ritual of sorts, has this central axis at the center of it. And for Haidt, that central axis is God, frankly. And he gets this and he grounds this in the thinking of Émile Durkheim, who is a French sociologist slash philosopher who sees, like Haidt does, the value of religion when it comes down to social organization. And Durkheim thinks basically that when people are making theological claims, they're basically confessing to certain kinds of sociological realities, right? When you look up and you sort of look at the clouds and you make a theological statement, what you're actually doing is kind of seeing society reflected in the clouds, and commenting on that. So Durkheim thinks that, in a sense, God is sort of a theological way of describing society, and that religion has a real and true and proper function. And so it's not something you can just say is stupid and throw out. But in fact, there's a lot going on there behind the scenes. Even if you don't believe in this kind of metaphysical entity named God, there is real value in religious behaviors. And Haidt takes up that same perspective. It's in this third section that he gets around to defining moral systems, and here's how he defines them. Moral systems are interlocking sets of values, virtues, norms, practices, identities, institutions, technologies, evolved psychological mechanisms that work together to suppress or regulate self-interest and make cooperative societies possible. Along with this definition of moral systems, let's see. Oh, I thought I had moral capital coming up. So this is how morality binds. Morality actually binds communities together. It makes them work sociologically more effectively than it would with just a group of individuals seeking their own self-interest. But it also blinds people when they think that that is the only true way of believing and acting. It blinds them to seeing the moral logics of other groups. It binds us into ideological teams that fight each other as though the fate of the world depended on each side winning the battle. It blinds us to the fact that each team is composed of good people who have something important to say. And he also puts out this concept of moral capital, the degree to which a community possesses interlocking sets of values, virtues, norms, practices. This is closely related to his definition of morality that enable the community to suppress or regulate selfishness and make cooperation possible. And I think this is my last slide. I'll just end with this. So when it comes down to trying to understand what conservatives are up to, he had said a more positive way to describe conservatives is to say that their broader moral matrix allows them to detect threats to moral capital that liberals cannot perceive. They do not oppose change of all kinds, such as the internet, but they fight back ferociously when they believe that change will damage the institutions and traditions that provide our moral exoskeletons, such as the family. Preserving these institutions and traditions is their most sacred value. I think that's it. Yeah. So I'll just tie it off there. That is a lot, I think, to reflect on. But let me leave just a little bit of open space for someone to chip in with a question or observation, criticism. Did you see in any of that anything to be concerned about or wary of?
Greg, I had a question. This is Pam.
Sure.
So I really like that 6 moral intuitions they're evolved, so we all have them. And I'm wondering why conservatives have all 6, the way he designates it, and liberals have 3. Why is that? What fosters that?
I guess my sense is that he would say that liberal ideology has basically suppressed those 3. That the commitments of a liberal perspective lead you to question things like sanctity and degradation, which are kind of religious in nature, and that liberal ideology, which has probably its origins in Enlightenment philosophy, is similarly critical of anything having to do with religion. And you would find probably on average that many liberals, even today, would be skeptical about organized, revealed religion, right? I mean, and you can see that in the way that the Democrats have not made effective appeals to religious ideology, right? They've completely ceded that ground to Republicans. So that's definitely a weakness on the liberal side. As far as the others go, I mean, the Enlightenment Project is also very anti-authoritarian. And so some of aspects of liberal ideology, I think he would say, would kind of suppress those three moral taste receptors when it comes down to progressives and liberals. That's what I think he would say. But maybe you just need to figure out how to kind of retranslate those rather than just getting by with three. Maybe there are ways to sort of translate those or put those in different terms. If you think about loyalty, for example, right? I think certainly we can think of loyalty in kind of negative ways, right? Like the way that President Trump conceives of loyalty is loyalty to him as an individual and sacrificing whatever moral qualms you might have in favor of loyalty to him as an individual. But perhaps loyalty could be reconfigured as loyalty to the group overall and the overall good of the group.
Hey,
Right.
Greg,
Yeah, there may be ways.
Right.
Yeah.
Joe Papovich. That last slide that you had up made me wonder how our society, thinking about these different points, how our society looks at our racial history, our history with race. So we have an institute. If we change our institutions, that might create more justice, let's say, for us, members of our society who have been traditionally treated unjustly. But that results in a change in the institution. So folks push back, don't want to see those kinds of changes because it disrupts the way things always have been. I started thinking first when we were talking about, I was thinking about the taking the knee at the national anthem. That's seen by conservatives as being wrong to the flag, but it's part of a larger effort to achieve justice. So when they conflict, how does one decide which of the values is more important than the others?
Yeah. Well, and to be honest, I think that is a fundamental weak spot of this book. I mean, he's a very astute sort of cultural psychologist and sociologist. It seems to me to be kind of weak on the historical front. And people's elephants aren't, they come from somewhere. They are historically and sort of geographically conditioned. And when it comes down to institutions and traditions that conservatives defend, some of those institutions and traditions are deeply flawed and deeply unjust. I mean, when you think about just the kind of the ferocious racism that is endemic in American society that is just still with us in so many profound ways. It doesn't seem to me that finally Haidt has a good answer for that some of these institutions and traditions that people are practicing, like, well, of course, Black people are inferior to white people. I mean, of course, why should we give women the vote? That's just, why should we feel bad about taking land away from savages? I mean, those are institutions and traditions, and those have got to be critiqued. And it seems to me that makes it pretty clear that some of these moral foundations are in fact very susceptible to either misuse, or maybe they ought to just be chucked out, or somehow reconfigured. So this, I mean, you've touched on one of the things that I think is a kind of a fundamental weak spot, or at least it strikes me as deeply questionable about this book. So even if I were to say, yeah, this is a fascinating and challenging and interesting and useful book, there's some fundamental ways that I couldn't go along with it.
Hey, Greg, I couldn't help noticing in that, I think it was the next to last slide, where he says that good people on both sides. I believe I've heard that before.
Yeah, I knew what you're You think of Charlottesville?
Yep.
And I'd like to make a comment while we're both off. How would he deal with the cult phenomenon, which I think we are seeing with the Trump people, who seem to throw out all of these moral points in order to follow a human being that they're not questioning very much.
Yeah. Well, I think I would race to say that he would have not a molecule of sympathy for Trump, and so he would, I think, would criticize folks on that same ground and say that is loyalty gone terribly wrong.
Cool.
So, I think he would want to defend what most of us would say, at one point in time, yeah, there may have been, a conservative tradition that articulated a sort of a reasonable and defensible set of principles, and that might actually be a good conversation partner for people coming at things from a more progressive and liberal side. I think that kind of sensible conservatism is what he would want to defend, not what's going on now in the current American scene. He would rush to say that that's an aberration, but he would say, I think, that liberals and progressives are not as sensitive as they should be to the moral capital that makes a society run and function, and that they would be too quick to either dismiss that or disrupt it in favor of change.
Greg, we probably ought to be aware of time.
Yeah. Oh, yes. So maybe shall I sign off with a quick word of prayer here, and then we can call it quits?
Sounds good, please. Thank you.
Okay. Gracious God, thank you for this opportunity to be together, to share each other's company, and to think about these important topics as we head into the Christmas season. Help our reflection, help our thinking and feeling, and our courage and our hope, we pray. Amen.
Thank you so much, Greg.
Hey, Greg, thank
My
you.
pleasure.
Thank you, Greg. Fascinating and interesting topic.
Thanks, Susan.
Thank you, Greg.
I'll linger around here in case anyone wants to.
Well, Steve had a question. Had his hand up.
Could you minimize the slideshow so we could see faces?
Yeah. Here's a second here. Stop share. Okay. Yeah.
My comment goes back to Joe's, what do you do in the face of conflict between principles, and how do you sort and navigate that when it happens, principles in tension with one another? And back to the chickens, they sort it with a pecking order. And you can sort principles with a pecking order, which is a little bit about what liberals do. It's not a single tier of 6 equal principles. They're tiered. If you were to press someone, you could take all 6 and probably line them up 1 through 6, which is the most important. For me, I put do no harm. And it's very easy for me to argue, I think, that that's certainly more important than being loyal and is not harming anyone. And I don't have a problem making that argument. And to think that, how do you sort it if you don't order them? If they're all equal and there's tension between them, I think you sort it with denial that there's even a tension. And that is just, that's, not a functional way for society to work.
Yeah. Yeah. And I suppose that's just kind of built into if you think of these things as taste receptors, that and like sweet and salty are just two different non-intersecting kinds of taste buds. You don't talk about a hierarchy between sweet and salty, right? They're just two separate things. But if you think about moral foundations in that same way, that there's not one moral foundation that might be superior to another that should be ranked ahead of another, then maybe you're committed to, a kind of an unclear moral architecture, as it were. And that there's going to be certain kinds of confusion, and that, authority and subversion, right? It sounds like that's pretty well lined up for fascist governments and entities to capitalize on. I mean, maybe maybe in that sense, it's sort of good to have in mind that is a kind of a taste receptor that people can, or certain groups can appeal to, but that is one that you better watch out for, not necessarily privilege, right? You might say people are susceptible to those kinds of appeals, and those on the liberal and progressive side might say, okay, yeah, that's a taste receptor, but it's a dangerous one. And when people are making too many appeals to that, you better watch out. I mean, maybe that is, I think, what you're saying, well, maybe we ought to rank these things and arrange them in certain orders.
Right. That's sort of thing I was getting at, that it was interesting that on the liberal side, he didn't have the loyalty component, right? Loyalty to the institutions. Wasn't that one of the ones he did not include?
Correct.
And so I would say that's probably right. For us people who look at ourselves as being more liberal than others, we would say that institution that causes these injustices, or that thing called the flag, is not nearly as important to me as a liberal than would some of these other ones about justice and morality, et cetera. Whereas it seems as if he's saying, but for a conservative person, these would rank equally in some manner, more so than they would with me.
Yeah. And I guess whether, in talking with someone across the political gap, you might say, these are the things that are motivating them. And this is maybe one of the values of the book. Even if you sort of step back from saying, okay, these moral foundations are right, or in fact, some of these are dangerous and we should arrange them in a certain hierarchy. Maybe, some of the value of this book would be helping you to say, the people that are on the other side of the aisle here that are separated from me by this divide, this is what's informing their thinking. This is what is making their elephant do certain things. And if I want to speak with them and reason with them and relate with them, I got to talk to the elephant. And this is what's going to help me understand their elephant. Now, you may not have to think that authority and subversion and loyalty and betrayal and sanctity and degradation are good moral taste receptors, but you might say they are what that person's elephant is smelling and operating based on. And that's going to help me talk to their elephant. Man.
Greg, is it possible, I keep thinking that liberals and conservatives would just define those six differently. In other words, like loyalty and betrayal. So maybe a liberal would say, well, I'm talking about loyalty to Jesus, where it says everybody's accepted at the table, rather than it's got to be a rigid sentence out of the book of John or something. So, and I could look at sanctity and degradation. I would say it's the sanctity of every human soul, every human person on this planet. So would it be that we could define what those intuitions translate to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it might be possible to kind of rewrite those, and he doesn't do that. But that would seem to be kind of a reasonable project. Like, it's just, as you were just saying that, like, I don't know if you can see this in the, I'm not sure that's going to come through. That is what he says is basically the liberal kind of moral foundations. The big thick column on the left is care and harm, and that second one is what cheating and fairness, and that the little ones over here are the authority and subversion, loyalty, betrayal, sanctity, and degradation. Whereas, and so what you're saying, Pam, is no, progressives and liberals, they ought to be able to figure out ways to appeal to those taste receptors without, in different ways than conservatives are. And so he would, and then, I mean, by contrast, where's the, he says that conservatives are basically making appeals to all of those six in roughly equal measure.
I think the liberals are making appeals to all of them. Just as, I'm throwing this out, I don't know, just as much as conservatives. We would just define it differently. So we would have to talk about, well, how do you define sanctity? And I might define sanctity. What's sacred to me may be a different definition of what's sacred to somebody else, but we both hold sanctity highly.
Yeah, well, I think he would. I think that's a promising project. You might. Yeah, I mean, it does seem to be the case that when you think about appeals to religion and religious sensibilities, Republicans have been more successful at doing that than Democrats, right? And I think is a great sort of fault on the side of liberals and progressives. But it should be possible, like you say, to maybe redefine some of those things and to kind of rejuvenate those appeals to what maybe, if you buy into this moral foundation stuff, sort of dormant taste receptors, but you just have to do it in different terms that weren't reactionary or open to fascist misinterpretation or just propping up the status quo.
He drew that drawing like a conservative. You had, 6 solid pillars under the foundation of our moral fiber. And then the liberals had 3 rickety little, thrown together little things. I mean, his picture was objectionable. I mean, you could just see conservatism sort of marinating this guy at least from today's session.
Yeah. Well, I guess you'd have to ask, does he feel, well, and I think he is kind of sympathetic with it. Is he saying that that's how it ought to be, that that's normative, or that's just descriptive? Right? I mean, I think he would say, at least he would say it's descriptive.
I don't think you draw a picture like that without normative. Clearly, one of those is a better foundation than the other. You don't have 3 little rickety things supporting your foundation. And you show those 2 pictures without labels and say, which of these is the better foundation for something you're trying to build? 6 solid pillars, or 1 real solid one, 1 sort of solid one, and 3 real rickety ones. It's pretty clear that there's, kind of a superiority, inferiority viewpoint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think he definitely he claims to not want to be normative in the sense that he's arguing for the truth of something, and that he'd want to say this is mostly descriptive, but he tilts in the direction of normative, I'd say.
And the last thing, and I did not realize he would drive me as crazy as he did. I some of his stuff, but it's driving me a little nuts. The other piece is the socialistic versus libertarian spectrum that we exist upon. And if culturally, if you were to put us somewhere and then do what he's doing, I think this whole thing changes. I mean, his sort of moral framework to me is very sort of on the individual sort of end of that sort of spectrum of cultures. If you were to go somewhere in Asia, for example. I mean, he spent time in India. I'm just, it seems to me that this thing is very American and skewing towards libertarian in terms of a moral foundation of a libertarian country or something.
I mean, I think he'd object against that. I mean, I think he would want to say that what you get in sort of religious belief and ideology is a way of maintaining the group and the moral capital of the group, and that's a fundamental aspect of human existence, is that group behavior. And that he would, maybe again, he smells like he's libertarian in some ways, and maybe that's just my description of it. But I think he would want to separate himself from that libertarian perspective. He would want to say that what I'm doing here is actually trying to restore a certain kind of integrity to the group and group functions, and that conservatives are seeing that in a way that liberals are not. That's what I think he would say. It's okay that he drives you nuts. I mean, there's, like I said, some good things about this book, but finally, I just, when it comes to race and racism and things about society that need to change, if people took up this perspective, those things would not now be changed.
To Pam's question about why, I mean, the way he came at this originally, from my understanding, was that he did a bunch of surveys of people that self-identified, and then he was able to take those same surveys and predict, after he sort of sorted with this study of folks who self-identified as liberal or conservative. And it doesn't necessarily explain why they're that way. It just sort of observes them as that way, if you know what I mean. It's more of a tool of prediction of politics than it is kind of a description of why we are the way we are. I don't think Pam's question, is there anything, I mean, does he get at the why at all? I mean, to me, it just seems, okay, this is what a bunch of conservatives said were important to him. Okay, here's what a bunch of liberals said were important to him, and now I'm going to use it as a tool to predict it going forward. That's, to me, what he did.
I mean, I guess I don't get the prediction quite so much. I think he would want to say that this isn't necessarily something to, I guess it could be predictive in the sense that if someone identifies as a conservative, you could then predict what they, might say about a certain issue. But I think he would want to say, he would have an answer for the why, why people do this. And he would seek those out in evolutionary biology or in evolutionary sociology and how groups evolve. And so I think he would be able to give an answer to that question of why.
Yeah, I knew he did it as a predictor just because the UVA moral foundations thing has these little tests you can take. You take them and then they tell you you're a liberal or a conservative.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I haven't actually gone. There is yourmoralfoundations.org, isn't it? Yeah. So you can drop in on that. I could have said something about that.
How'd you do when you took the test, Steve? You came out as a conservative?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to end. I think liberals have just as many moral intuitions as anybody else. We would just define them differently. I don't feel that I'm any less moral or concerned about sanctity and loyalty than anyone who is hard conservative. I think we would just define it differelly.
That's a tribute to your high moral character.
Pardon me?
That's a tribute to your high moral character.
Yeah. I think liberals, high moral character, caring about, so I just think we would define them differently. I think that we ought to reclaim the sanctity of what we're hoping for.
Well, you might, going back to Steve's, like criticism of, the visual layout there. So maybe maybe liberals and progressives have one big care harm muscle. That, maybe that's why progressives will make certain kinds of progress that conservatives won't, when it comes down to fighting for certain things that they think are just wrong. And so maybe that kind of accentuation or emphasis or lopsidedness in a certain way is one of the things that drives the social struggle in favor of causes that advance care and freedom. Whereas if you equally value all of these things, maybe you're just going to be a little too static and stable and steady and not make certain kinds of advances.
The other thing that happens when you value all these things equally is you create a vulnerability to what we've just experienced. There's ambiguity and cloudiness to your moral thinking that allows someone to unmoor society from a moral sort of contact point. And then we float around in this ill-defined, mess of ambiguity of morals and end up where we've just ended up. And to be unable to sort of debate what's more important. You seriously are going to tell me that authority is just as important as doing no harm? Seriously? You're going to try to make that point? If you are, then this is where we're going to end up, in this sort of ambiguity of power decides it, not actual moral principles, because you can't even debate them. You can just say what they are.
Mm-hmm.
I'd vote for you, Steve.
I'm disturbed this morning for Sunday school. What happened?
Well, but it's interesting. So so you and Pam are taking up, the sort of the same issue. Like, you want to say that some of these, Pam wants to do some redefinition of some of these moral foundations, right? You think it should be possible for liberals and progressives to kind of retranslate these things into other terms. Let's say you got off of, I wouldn't know exactly how to do that, but you could do that. Whereas Steve wants to, would you just chuck out some of these, Steve? You definitely want to arrange them. You say you don't want to have you want to have a hierarchy between these things.
Some of these things are tools, and they're not principles. They're not moral principles. Authority makes sense to have as a way for things to work. It doesn't make sense to drive what's right or wrong. It just makes sense to drive what works or doesn't work. And so to elevate it to the right and wrong is dangerous, actually, to your point earlier, that somebody's actually thinking that it's right to sort of genuflect in front of Kim Jong or whatever. It's just nuts.
Yeah. Well, he's sensitive to that. He's not unaware of it. At one point in the book, I'd have to go scout it out. He gives a little quotation that fits really well with that authority subversion taste receptor. And then on the next page says, well, it sounds great until you realize that this is Mussolini, who wrote this quote. So he's sensitive to the fact that could tilt in certain directions.
And I agree with Pam too. I think that I think that some are, to my earlier point, is that I do think that even the definitions as you did them were conservatives' definitions of the moral principles, and that I would take sort of umbrage with some of the definitions of the principles themselves. Yes. And I'd want some of them not necessarily tossed out as tools for us to use, but they're not moral principles. And the ones that are left behind, I'd even want to order them. Because do no harm to me is number one, and it's like a pyramid. It's not a taste bud.
Yeah,
I think that
if you range them as 6 kind of equal, independent things, you do end up with that situation.
and there's a fair amount of subjectiveness in each of these words. You know, what I perceive as being fair, you or someone on the other side might perceive as cheating. What I perceive as being authority, you might say that's oppressive authority. It's authority that protects your tribe, but it subverts my tribe, so I have to fight back. So what seems to be sanctity to me, you might see as not. What seems to be fair to me, right? There's just that subjectiveness in that, what these words mean, depending on your tribe versus my tribe, what my interests are versus your interests.
Even to have cheating as the word that's the opposite of fair. It implies that what is fair and in cheating has to do with following the rules or not following the rules. It doesn't say anything about whether the rules themselves are fair, whether the field is level or not. And so to cheat is to not play on you don't cheat when you're playing on an uneven playing field. You cheat when you violate the rules of the game. So fairness is a much more robust sort of principle than just comparing it up to cheating alone. Is a very limited perspective of what fairness really is.
It's a really good point.
Yeah.
You need to go. So.
Yeah, and
Thank you.
Megan, you might need
Thanks,
to go
Greg.
thank too. Thanks for
Thank
hanging
you
around.
all. That was great. Thank you. Thank
Happy
you.
birthday.
Happy birthday.
Oh, happy birthday.
Y'all, Steve, we'll keep carrying on with this.